Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We are exploring the ultimate 1,500-year theological detective story. The ultimate arch-villain of the Bible, the Serpent in Eden, is never actually called Satan in the entire Hebrew Bible. We are going to trace how a concept originally meant to just be a heavenly middle manager evolved into the Prince of Darkness, as ancient humanity grappled with the ultimate question: if God is perfectly good and sovereign, why is there so much suffering in the world?
Yeah, and for this deep dive, we're pulling from a really profound textual analysis by the scholar Nils Glenn. And just to set our baseline right out of the gate, we are not here to endorse a specific religion or to tear one down.
Right, yeah.
We're treating this purely as an exploration of literary and theological history. We're looking at what philosophers call the problem of evil. It's, the central theme that runs through ancient theology all the way up to modern debates surrounding atheism. We basically want to understand how ancient writers essentially had to develop the character of Satan in order to defend the character of God.
It is just such a fascinating lens to look through, especially when you consider, how much weight that single character carries in our cultural consciousness today. But hey, before we really get into the weeds of these ancient texts, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. So let's unpack this core mystery.
Let's do it.
The detail from the source material that immediately stopped me in my tracks is about the book of Genesis. The word Satan simply does not appear there.
No, it doesn't.
In fact, the serpent is never identified as Satan anywhere in the Old Testament. So, who or what was this entity originally supposed to be?
Right. So to figure that out, we really have to strip away centuries of cultural baggage and look at the original ancient Hebrew. The word that gets translated into English as Satan is actually ha-Satan.
Ha-Satan, okay.
Yeah. And in Hebrew, just like in English, you do not put the definite article, like the word the, in front of a proper personal name.
Oh, right. You wouldn't say, like, the Michael or the Sarah.
Exactly. You just wouldn't say it.
Yeah.
So ha-Satan literally translates to the Satan, which means it cannot be a person's name. It has to be a title.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it translates to the adversary or something.
Yeah, the adversary or the opposer. It is entirely a function. It's a job description.
So it's basically like saying the prosecuting attorney in a courtroom.
That is the perfect modern equivalent, yeah. If you look at the book of Job specifically, the first two chapters, the Satan is depicted as a member of the divine council, which was known as the Elohim.
Right, the Elohim.
Yeah, and these were understood by the ancient writers as spiritual beings that partnered with God to govern the cosmos.
Okay, when you read Job with that context, the entire dynamic changes. His literal job description in that text is to patrol the earth, observe humanity, and challenge God's assessments. He isn't this malevolent demon with a pitchfork ruling over a fiery underworld. He's basically a cosmic corporate auditor.
A cosmic auditor, yeah, I like that.
Right. Like, he acts like a white hat hacker whose entire purpose is to stress test the faithfulness of human beings to see if their loyalty holds up under pressure. He even has to get God's explicit permission before he can do anything to Job. He's literally just doing his job.
And he's doing it with a pretty healthy dose of cynicism, too. But when we connect this auditor role to the broader picture of early Israelite theology, it actually fits perfectly.
Oh, so?
Well, in the earliest periods of these texts, like long before the Jewish people faced their greatest historical catastrophes, God was viewed as the direct, uncompromising cause of absolutely everything in the universe.
Everything. So both the good and the bad.
Exactly. Both the good and the bad. There was no need for a cosmic scapegoat to blame for natural disasters or suffering because God just did it all.
Wait, hold on. God was viewed as the direct cause of the bad things, too.
Oh, yeah. The prophet Isaiah states it without any hesitation whatsoever in Isaiah 45:7.
What does it say?
The text literally reads, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil.
Wow. Create evil.
Yeah. In that early worldview, God was the absolute sovereign author of all of it.
Well, that presents a massive psychological and philosophical wall.
Yep.
If you are experiencing profound trauma or injustice, and your worldview dictates that a perfectly good God is directly causing that suffering, that breaks the human mind.
It completely breaks it, yeah.
This brings us to what I think is, honestly, the most intense part of this whole evolution. It strikes right at the heart of the modern theism versus atheism debate. Like, how do you justify widespread suffering if a good God is pulling all the strings?
Well, you generally can't, not without severe cognitive dissonance. When a society goes through catastrophic collective trauma, the idea of a benevolent God directly orchestrating that horror becomes nearly impossible to reconcile.
Right.
And we actually get to see this theological crisis play out in real time. It's preserved right there in the biblical text through the story of King David's census.
Oh, this part blew my mind.
Mhm.
Because it's the exact same story told twice, right? But with one glaring monumental change.
Yes, exactly.
So in the older text, which is Samuel chapter 24, it explicitly states that God's anger was kindled against Israel. So God incites King David to take a census of the fighting men.
Right.
But taking this census is considered a massive sin, like a lack of trust in divine protection. And as punishment for the census that God himself incited, God sends a plague that wipes out 70,000 Israelites.
The theological implication there is just brutal. I mean, God engineers the sin, forces David into it, and then massacres 70,000 people as punishment for the very thing he orchestrated.
Yeah, it's incredibly dark. But then you turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 21, and this book was written centuries later by different scribes. The narrative is virtually identical.
Almost word for word in some places.
Right. The setup, the census, the 70,000 dead, it matches perfectly.
Yeah.
Except for the inciting incident.
Mm-hmm.
In Chronicles, it says Satan incited David to take the census.
Mm-hmm.
And the Hebrew source material shows something completely unprecedented here, doesn't it? The word drops the definite article.
It does. It drops the...
So it isn't Satan, the adversary. It is just Satan. This is the first time in the entire 1,500-year history of the Hebrew Bible that it is used as a proper name.
It is a massive watershed moment in religious history. It's the evolution from a job title to an independent, named entity.
I have to push back here, though. Looking at this purely objectively, isn't this just a blatant cover-up?
What do you mean?
Like, are the later writers essentially retconning their own sacred history to protect God's public relations? Because the idea of God slaughtering 70,000 people over a census he caused was just too horrific for later generations to swallow.
Oh, it is absolutely a theological retcon. And it's a textbook example of a concept called theodicy.
Theodicy.
Yeah, theodicy is the attempt to answer that age-old question. Why does a good God permit the manifestation of evil? It is the exact same paradox that modern atheists point to today.
Right, the classic problem of evil.
Exactly. By the time the Book of Chronicles was written, the early theology of God directly authoring evil was just no longer acceptable. The cultural mindset had completely shifted. So the scribes externalized the temptation. They shifted the direct blame to a spiritual adversary.
So they essentially sacrifice God's direct involvement in all things just to save his reputation as a benevolent creator.
Pretty much. It was a brilliant, necessary fix to a philosophical nightmare. God remains perfectly sovereign because he permitted the adversary to act, but he is shielded from being the direct active cause of the malicious temptation.
Okay, but you don't just wake up on a Tuesday and rewrite your foundational sacred texts.
No, you don't.
Something massive has to force that kind of radical shift. What happened between the writing of Samuel and the writing of Chronicles that made them so desperate to explain away suffering?
What happened was the complete obliteration of their world. In 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire besieged Jerusalem.
Oh, the Babylonian exile.
Yeah, and they didn't just conquer it, they leveled it. They burned the sacred temple to the ground, slaughtered the populace, and deported the surviving Jewish people into exile in Babylon.
Wow.
We really have to ground this in human reality. You know, these weren't scholars sitting in ivory towers debating abstract philosophy. These were grieving parents, displaced refugees, and traumatized survivors.
They were supposed to be God's chosen people in a promised land, and suddenly they were powerless captives in a foreign empire.
Exactly. They had to ask, how could a loving, sovereign God let our children be killed and our homes destroyed?
It's the ultimate human reflex. When your world completely falls apart, you demand answers. And you really only have two paths when faced with that kind of unfathomable, unjustifiable pain. You either abandon your belief system entirely, which is the route many take in modern atheism, just concluding there is no God at all, or you radically refine your beliefs to make sense of the chaos without losing your faith.
And they chose to refine it. While they were living in exile, eventually under Persian rule, they were heavily exposed to a new religion, Zoroastrianism.
Okay, Zoroastrianism.
Yeah. And Zoroastrianism operates on absolute dualism. It posits a perfectly good God, Ahura Mazda, who is locked in an eternal cosmic war with an equally powerful, independent, evil god, Angramanyu.
Wait, hold on. I'm confused here. If the Babylonians and Persians just destroyed their lives and enslaved them, Why would the Jewish exiles adopt the theology of their captors?
That's a great question.
Wouldn't human nature dictate that you utterly reject the religion of the people oppressing you?
That is a fantastic point, and it's actually where a lot of surface-level history gets this wrong. They didn't just copy and paste Persian theology into their scrolls.
Oh, it didn't? No.
What the trauma of the exile did was force the scribes to look back at their own existing texts for answers. The seeds of rebellious spiritual beings were already planted in their tradition.
Oh, right. Like the mysterious watchers mentioned in Genesis 6, or the corrupt divine council being judged in Psalm 82.
Exactly those texts. They took those existing obscure elements and wove them together to create a robust theology of an adversary. It was essentially a sociological coping mechanism.
That makes so much more sense.
But they maintained one crucial, fiercely guarded distinction from the Persian Zoroastrians. They refused to give up God's ultimate sovereignty.
No.
In their newly refined theology, Satan is never an equal, eternal rival to God. He's a created being. He is fundamentally subordinate and entirely under God's control.
So it's not a yin-and-yang battle of equals. It's a localized rebellion that the authors believe is already doomed to fail.
Exactly.
And this brings us to the Second Temple period. As these communities are dealing with successive waves of brutal oppression from the Greeks and then the Romans, this theology of a cosmic enemy really explodes.
Yeah.
And they start giving this adversary a multitude of different names to explain the specific horrors they are facing.
Yeah, and the names they chose are incredibly revealing about how they were processing their trauma.
Like, give me some examples.
Well, for instance, in a text called the Book of Jubilees, the adversary is named Mastema, which translates to hostility or hatred. And Mastema serves a very specific theodicy function for the writers.
Okay.
The author of Jubilees was clearly disturbed by older scriptures where God did something morally horrifying like demanding that Abraham sacrifice his own son Isaac.
Right. That story has always been deeply troubling.
Exactly. So the author rewrites that narrative. In Jubilees, it isn't God who suggests the horrific test, it is Mastema.
Oh, wow. Getting God off the hook again for the things that offended their evolving moral sensibilities.
Yep. Then you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were written by an apocalyptic Jewish sect living in intense isolation out in the desert, facing severe persecution. They use the name Belial, which means worthlessness.
Belial, okay.
For them, the world was so broken that they needed a theology of absolute extremes. They believed they were fighting a profound cosmic war between the sons of light and the forces of darkness led by Belial. It was really the only way they could psychologically survive their isolation.
And then there is Beelzebul, which is such a fascinating sociological maneuver.
Oh, it really is.
Because originally, Beelzebul was a rival Canaanite storm god. But the Israelites mockingly changed a single letter to make it Beelzebub, which translates to Lord of the Flies.
Right, just a subtle insult.
They took a terrifying neighboring deity and turned him into a demonized adversarial pest. It's a way of stripping power from the things that frighten you. I mean, all these different names, Mestaboli, Belial, Beelzebul, they are all pointing to the exact same adversarial role. They're all desperate attempts to explain the presence of evil. But the most brilliant literary move happens when they take this fully formed theology of a cosmic enemy and project it backward. They look all the way back to page 1, back to the Garden of Eden.
This is where we see the immense sophistication of ancient literary traditions. The Hebrew word used for the serpent in Genesis 3 is Nahash.
Nahash.
And Nahash is a remarkably complex triple entendre. It basically operates on 3 overlapping meanings simultaneously.
Oh, break those down for me, because this completely shifts how we read that foundational story.
Okay, so first, as a noun, it literally means a serpent or a snake.
Right, the classic translation we all know.
Exactly. Second, it is derived from a root word meaning to shine or gleam, much like polished bronze. So it also translates to a shining one or a radiant divine being.
Wait, a radiant being?
Yeah. And third, the verb form of the word means to practice divination, to enchant, or to whisper magic secrets.
Oh, wow. So when an ancient Hebrew reader engaged with Genesis 3, they weren't just picturing a literal reptile hanging from a branch holding an apple.
Not at all.
They were reading about a radiant divine rebel, a shining one who was actively practicing deception and offering forbidden supernatural knowledge to humanity. That is incredible.
It really is.
It functions almost exactly like a masterfully written thriller or a mystery novel. The clues about the villain's true identity and cosmic nature were hiding in plain sight in the very first chapter, woven into the language itself. But you only realize the depth of it once you reach the end of the narrative, and understand the complete theological picture.
Yeah, the original author of Genesis didn't need to explicitly use the proper name Satan because the ancient audience would have immediately recognized the Nahash as a rebellious spiritual entity.
Right.
But as the centuries passed and the problem of evil forced the theology of the adversary to crystallize, later readers explicitly connected those dots. They reasoned that the figure who introduced mortality and corruption into the pristine human environment had to be the ultimate adversary.
Because his domain subsequently became the realm of the dead, right?
Exactly.
And yet, it isn't until the literal end of the Christian Bible, the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 9, that a text finally and explicitly links all these fragmented identities together.
Yeah, the very end.
It refers to the great dragon as that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan. It takes a 1,500-year literary journey to finally state it outright. But this brings up a massive contradiction that I think we need to resolve.
Okay, what's that?
Well, if the original biblical text described this entity as a shining one, a radiant, intelligent, divine being, why does our modern culture universally picture a guy in red tights with a goatee, horns, and a pitchfork?
Yeah. The visual drift from the ancient source material to our modern cultural understanding is just staggering. In the biblical text, Satan is genuinely terrifying specifically because of his subtlety and his beauty.
Mm-hmm.
The Apostle Paul famously describes him as disguising himself as an angel of light. He is presented as highly intelligent, deeply reasonable, and incredibly attractive to human desires.
So he's not a monster.
Not at all. He is referred to as the god of this world because by successfully tempting humanity in Eden, he introduced death. In ancient cosmology, introducing death made him the de facto ruler of the underworld, which was known as Sheol.
Oh.
And that strange curse in Genesis where God tells the serpent he will eat dust is actually ancient metaphorical language. The dead return to dust, so the serpent eating dust means he will rule over the deceased in the underworld.
Right, so there is no red suit in the text, there are no horns, no cloven hooves, and absolutely no pitchfork anywhere in the biblical descriptions.
Yeah.
So where did this cartoonish Halloween costume actually come from?
Well, it was the result of a highly deliberate, highly effective smear campaign by the early Christian church.
A smear campaign.
Yeah. As Christianity began spreading rapidly through the Roman Empire, they encountered deeply entrenched pagan religions. They needed a way to stop the local populations from worshiping their traditional nature gods, so they simply demonized the iconography.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they looked at Pan, the Greek god of the wild, who is depicted with goat hooves, a tail, and horns, and declared to the public, that isn't a god of nature, that is the devil.
Honestly, that's just aggressive branding.
It is entirely about branding. They did the exact same thing with the Greco-Roman god of the underworld, Hades, or Pluto. He was traditionally depicted carrying a two-pronged staff called a bident, which looks a lot like a pitchfork.
Right.
The early church took that weapon, handed it to their concept of Satan, and basically mashed all the imagery together.
I mean, it makes sense. You want people to stop worshiping the local deity. You don't argue theology with them. You just paint their god as the literal terrifying embodiment of cosmic evil. And that imagery gets locked in during the Middle Ages, doesn't it?
Oh, the medieval period takes that branding campaign to a completely new level. We have to remember that the vast majority of the European public at that time was entirely illiterate.
Right.
They weren't learning complex theology by reading Paul's letters or studying the Hebrew root words in Genesis. They learned their worldview by staring at the frescoes and stained glass windows on church walls.
Yeah, visual storytelling.
Exactly. The artists commissioned by the church needed a visual shorthand for evil that was instantly recognizable and viscerally scary.
So they amalgamate the red fire of the underworld, the horns and hooves of the pagan god Pan, and the pitchfork of Hades into one monstrous figure.
Yes. And then, in the 14th century, Dante Alighieri writes his epic poem, The Inferno.
Oh, of course.
He takes all of that terrifying, monstrous church art and weaves it into a cultural masterpiece. And that deeply solidifies that specific grotesque imagery in the Western cultural imagination forever.
It just becomes culturally embedded, from Renaissance paintings all the way down to modern cartoons. But stepping back and looking at the original source material, there is a profound irony in what we've done.
What do you mean?
Well, by turning this complex, radiant, intellectual adversary into a literal cartoon character, we actually completely undermine the original text.
Oh, we severely diminish it. Portraying Satan as a ridiculous, monstrous guy in a red suit turns the concept of evil into a parody. I mean, think about it practically. A glaring red monster with horns is incredibly easy to spot and therefore very easy to dismiss.
Right, it isn't a real threat.
Exactly. But an attractive, entirely reasonable angel of light who appeals directly to your intellect, your vanity, and your desires, that is a genuinely dangerous concept. The ancient texts were warning their readers about an adversary who doesn't announce his malevolent intentions, but rather subtly twists the truth until you compromise your own morals. The pitchfork caricature entirely masks the sophisticated psychological threat those ancient writers were actually trying to convey.
That is such a profound point.
Yeah.
So to bring this massive 1500-year evolution into focus, we started with a heavenly prosecutor in the book of Job. It wasn't a name, but a title for a divine auditor whose role was merely to stress test human loyalty.
Right.
But as the ancient Jewish people endured unimaginable historical trauma, the burning of their temple, the forced exile to Babylon, centuries of brutal occupation by foreign empires, they hit a theological breaking point.
They really did.
They had to reconcile a brutal, bloody reality. How do we explain the existence of horrific suffering without abandoning our foundational belief in a loving, perfectly sovereign God?
And, their solution wasn't to throw away their faith, nor was it to simply appropriate the dualistic gods of their conquerors. They meticulously mined their own ancient texts. They pulled out the obscure threads of rebellious divine councils, the mysterious watchers, and the radiant divining Nahash in the Garden of Eden, and they wove them into a unified theology.
It's incredible.
They evolved the concept of the heavenly auditor into the ultimate prince of darkness. They externalized the origin of evil to protect the goodness of God, all while maintaining the core belief that this adversary was ultimately subordinate and already defeated.
It is just a stunning look at how human beings process immense trauma and construct theological meaning to survive it. Which brings me to this final thought. We have spent this time looking backwards, seeing how ancient people spent 15 centuries evolving the concept of a cosmic adversary just to make sense of their suffering and preserve their view of a good universe. Yep. It really makes you wonder, in our modern age, when you are confronted with our own inexplicable tragedies, systemic failures, and chaos, what new adversaries or narratives are we constructing right now just to help ourselves sleep at night?